We are talking valves here. So, fire engine plumbing, we have all kinds of valves in the backs of our trucks, middles of our trucks, underneath our trucks, all over the place. And they're standardized or relatively standardized. Various agencies have different setups, and even those are relatively standardized, or not even, they are relatively standardized. Every agency has a fairly standardized system. Fish and Wildlife might be the exception, but even then, they're generally following the same principles. The Forest Service has a standardized valve set. So the 20 standard valves, or rather 22 now, and we keep adding more. When I did Engine Academy 18 years ago, it was only 13. So we're adding things to the mix, and we certainly have things we don't use anymore, but they haven't really left the identified list. So I'll refer you to the Water Handling Equipment Guide, version 2013, or the year 2013 for the version, page 48, and that has a list of the standard, the valve numbering system, standardized valve numbering system, and a little diagram there that kind of helps. And we'll be looking at both that and some other handouts that go out just depicting valves you use to do certain things here at the end of this. But to start with, we'll go through those valves one by one. So, number one, your tank to pump valve. That would be the valve that allows water from your tank to flow to your pump so that you can pump water. So these vary a little bit. They vary a lot less than they used to. Let's see if I can make this work. So on this guy here, you're looking at a drawbar. That's like your typical Type 6 engine. You pull that drawbar and it actuates the valve that's back behind it. Because I don't have a picture of the valve here. But it's just a quarter turn valve, just like a discharge. We'll see lots of them as we go. You pull that drawbar, that's your number one. And that gets water from your tank to your pump. Okay, same thing up here. This one right here is also a tank to pump number one. On your Type 3s and potentially on some Type 4s, you might end up with a air actuated valve like this where you have a toggle switch with the old aircraft safety cover over it, which are pretty cool. And that little toggle switch activates an air actuator on the valve. The valve is still a quarter turn brass valve under the truck. It's just remotely controlled by that switch. Number two, pump to tank. This would be returning water to your tank, or really it's not even returning water, it's pumping water to your tank. Number two is really, it's a discharge valve. It's the first discharge off the pump head, and it goes back to your tank. And actually sometimes, like our Type 6, it's not the first, it's the last discharge. But still, it is just a discharge, and you really should think of it that way. It's not necessarily on the suction side. It's not on the suction side, and it might be used in refilling. It should be used in refilling because that's what it's there for. But remember, it's a discharge. So you're seeing let me get this right. Seeing a quarter turn ball valve like that. That's done by hand. That'd probably be on a Type 4 more than likely. This is your standard configuration, or fairly standard configuration on a Type 6 engine. Just a quarter turn ball valve right there heading straight back into the tank. Should be a check valve between it and the tank most of the time. On your Type 3s, it's hidden. It's right here hidden behind this panel, but it's still a quarter turn ball valve, 1.5 inches. It's nothing special. Occasionally you'll find a few of those older Type 3s that'll have a 2-inch. Had one of those at one point, and that's fine. They work just fine. Just remember the 2 inches moving a lot more water, so you might have some prime issues if you don't have everything really dialed in a little bit tighter. But generally they're going to work fine. So That's your pump to tank valve. Number 2. Number 3 is your pump to discharge valve or overboard discharge. Or heck, they just call it a discharge. So, right here, that'd be a number 3 discharge, 1.5 inch off a Type 3 engine, and they just call it discharge. And that's fine. On this Type 4 next to it, it says number 3 1.5 inch discharge right here. So discharge is kind of the commonality there, because that's what it does. It pumps your hose lay, pumps your 1.5 inch hose. Number 3, see, I'm 3 slides into it, and something to be aware of is if there's a little gold star at the bottom, it probably means this is an important one to remember. Number four is your pump to live reel or your live reel or booster line. It's labeled hose reel there, and that's fine. That works. Lots of different names for it. The official is pump to hose reel, officially how it's listed, and that'll fire up your booster lines. You might have 2 of them. You might only have 1. Depends on your truck. Auxiliary discharge, number 5. Engine protection line or truck protection line, as that says. So this one used to be just an auxiliary discharge. That was what it was labeled as, and it was kind of intended for being an engine protection line, and we've just changed to actually calling it that. In fact, the valve numbering systems list there calls it engine protection, not auxiliary discharge. So either one of those answers is totally correct. Engine protection, auxiliary discharge. Generally, almost entirely, it is now used as an engine protection line. Number 6, pump to primer, or just your primer valve. This is an interesting one because this guy right here, right here, your primer valve, it's a primer and a switch. I'm sorry, it's a valve and a switch. So you pull that thing, it opens the valve, and it actuates an electric switch. That switch turns the little motor on in your primer. But water can't flow unless you pull out on that handle and open the valve. We'll take one of those apart and take a look at it in class so you can see how they work and how to clean them so they don't stick anymore. When I'm looking at these other ones, this water is here. I'm not actually sure what that came off of. It's possible that that's a electric switch that both actuates an electric valve and fires up that primer. Or you may have to manually throw a primer valve before you activate that electric switch. Here on the picture on the right there, that's the diaphragm primer farm type thing. They work really well. They're very effective. And I believe it's that valve right there, that little guy. You have to throw that valve, small little quarter turn valve, to make that work. And then once you fire up your pump and you're running water, you want to make sure you close that or you will pressurize your diaphragm and potentially break it. Don't see a ton of diaphragms on trucks anymore, but they're still out there and they're actually really useful as a spare. Number 7, adjustable pressure relief valve. This valve is really what you're looking at here is this guy, and that's the control for it. The valve itself is inside the truck underneath it in the big plumbing components. That valve can be set to a specific pressure, and if you exceed that pressure, it will open a valve and bleed all the extra volume off into the tank. We're not getting these anymore. They're really great. They have a really good application in the structural world when you're plugged into hydrants and moving high volume. We don't move high volume, we move high pressure. really not what this thing was designed for. Um, but they are still out there. The idea that this was going to be the trick, the answer to mobile attack in a PTO truck. This was a really popular idea that you could set your pressure. I want my pressure to be 150 psi. Set my pressure, and if the driver, throttles up, I don't overpressurize the nozzle min. Instead, it bleeds it all back into the tank. And that was a great idea, and in theory, it'd be wonderful if we could get it to work, but we're moving such low volume, it doesn't really work that well. It's not as sensitive as we would want. And really, if you're, geared down the way you should be, especially with the automatic transmissions we have anymore, overpressurizing the nozzle min is not really a problem. So yeah, you need to have quite a bit of RPM to be able to get the pressure up to where they can't handle it. And you'd have to be moving high volume, which if you're doing mobile attack, you probably don't want to be. Anyway, that's an adjustable pressure relief valve. Be aware of that it's there. That's what that little wheel does. Those things have to be exercised regularly, weekly, if not daily, or they will get sticky. And if it decides to stick in the open position and you can't get it to close, you will not be able to build any more pressure than whatever it's set at. And that can be very problematic. It happened to me. Mine stuck open at about 30 psi, and we were in the middle of a lightning bust. So that was a bit problematic. We did finally figure out how to get it closed. A little tapping on it with a hammer mixed with some water hammering on it to try and get it closed did work. And it did it again about 6 months later during a training, and we ended up taking the whole thing out and taking it down to the pump shop and honing the interior of it to make it work. You can crank that thing all the way up higher and it's locked out and it won't open. And that's where I usually leave it. And then if I want to use it, I bring it down to whatever pressure I want to use it at. If we have one of these at the academy, we will show you how it works. Hopefully not lock out somebody's engine. Number 8 is your overboard suction, also labeled overboard draft. And you can see here on this one, not only do you have a port to plug your draft hose into, you have a drawbar. The drawbar is what actuates the valve that's in there. You do have a valve on your suction. And that part's probably less shocking to all of you than it is to me. But so there's a valve buried inside that, behind that panel, and that drawbar actuates that valve. So you can hook everything up while everything's still going, and you're pumping water, and you can switch over to a draft by actuating valves, and it's much better to have a valve. You can do a lot of cool things that way. If you look at the bottom left here, this guy's on a Type 6 engine. Type 6? Yeah, that's my draft on a Type 6 engine. And it's mounted right to the valve itself. The valve is exterior. It's not buried underneath the truck. Some of the older trucks, really not a lot of stuff we use anymore, but you may find one with a cooperator agency. They'll just have a cap at the end of the pipe. And that's it. That's all they have for a valve is just the cap at the end of the pipe. And if you are going to pull water from a source or draft from a source, you have to shut down your pumping operation to do so, which 90% of the time is fine because 90% of the time you drove to the water source to get filled back up. It's that other 10 or less percent of the time that you want to switch from pumping a hose lay that you just laid out to pumping that same hose lay out of a water source like a folded tank you just set up. That it's nice if you can do it without shutting down the operation. We'll try and we will be teaching you how to do that if you don't know. Number 9, reserve supply from tank to pump. I don't have a picture because I haven't seen one ever. But once upon a time, we used to have a reserve tank of 30 to 50 gallons in some of our trucks, and there was a second valve that you could open to tap into that reserve, safety water or whatever you want to call it. That 10% that you're supposed to leave in your tank. Now we just have the operators manage it. We don't have a reserve tank to tap into. I have seen it on a couple of water tenders where they'll have it's not really a reserve supply, but they'll have an extra amount in the bottom that you have to open a different valve for. Of course, water tenders are less standardized, so they don't always have everything the same. No longer widely in use, not a critical one to memorize, but it is there. Need to cover it. Number 10 is the in-tank shutoff valve, or up against the tank shutoff valve is how I've seen most number 10s. Not we don't really use these anymore either. The number 1 does the same thing. It shuts the water off coming out of the tank into the rest of the plumbing system. And these were used on the old Model 45 PTO Type 6 trucks. And it's possible you may see one of those again one day. The way the plumbing was set up on those, the number 1 was a little bit too high to be able to shut the number 1 off and not fill a ton of water into the plumbing. So there was a shutoff valve right at the tank. That's number 10. Number 11, plumbing drain or master drain. These things are great. The picture on the left there, that's a master drain. That is the valve. You turn it, it's a quarter turn, and it drains all the low spots in the truck. It takes a Type 3 from having anywhere from 8 to 15 petcocks under the truck to having 3. So that's a vast improvement. On the right, this guy right here is attached to a collector valve that you pull that lever out, and there's like a cord piece of wire, and it pulls open the valve, and it drains all of the drain lines in the truck at one point. They all come down to the same valve. This has completely eliminated the need for petcocks on Type 6 engines in general. I don't believe there's any left. So, number 11, master drain. Number 12 is a pump coolant clean out. This one, we hadn't seen one, we hadn't really had one of these in a long time. And then the last couple evolutions of engines that came out, standards were, they had them on there. It's like, oh, wow, that's cool. So your bypass is your number 17. We'll get to it in a minute. And my mouse here. It's circulating that water from the pump back into the tank. And as it does that, it has a little filter in there. Well, if you have a bypass cleanout, it has a filter in there. And every so often you need to clean out that filter. And you do so by simply turning that quarter turn valve right there and making sure that your clean out right there is uncapped, and it'll blast some water through that that filter. It's just a little Y strainer filter, and clean that out, and then you're still moving water when your bypass is open. 12, pump coolant clean out. Number 13 is a gravity drain, and it can be a direct fill or dry fill setup. We'll focus on the gravity drain because that's my preference. But so big truck here, Type 3, but it's an older one. So big square tube, you open that valve up and you dump all of the water out of your tank. That's how it's going to work. That's a gravity drain. These are the newer Type 3s have this, and that's an inch and a half. Yeah, I think that's inch and a half. That might be 2 inch. Anyway, it's probably inch and a half. That's a gravity drain. It's just a piece of pipe that goes straight into your tank, and you can dump your water out of it. One thing that's handy with the valved one, like on the newer Type 3s, is you can hook up a piece of suction line to that with a reducer on it, and you can dump the tank of water and you actually direct it. It can be kind of handy. They're just gravity out of a tank. That's it. When you do that, you would usually use that to fill a full tank or to dump the water out. like a Type 6 engine, it has a number 13. It has a gravity drain at the bottom of the truck. It's just not useful for anything but draining the tank. You can't actually do anything else with it. And then we have dry fills. So dry fills are a bit, well, they're interesting. So it's more or less a direct line that goes into the tank that you could hook up a hose to, and using a portable pump or off a hydrant, you can push water in without having to climb up on top of the truck. It's a great idea. Um, there's a couple problems with that we'll hit on in the hydrant section, but briefly, that do not exceed 50 psi is very important. If you exceed 50 psi, the potential to damage your baffling and your poly tank is very high. If you do it once, you're probably okay. If you do it 10 times, you're probably okay. If you consistently do it a lot, you will break it. It will overpressurize your tank and you will cause significant damage. I have done it. They're very difficult to fix. We had to strip all the diamond plate off of, well, this truck over here, on this truck over here. All that diamond plate had to come off, and a guy had to come and climb into the tank and re-weld it all together. So be very careful with those. We'll get a little more into it later. Backflow prevention is your other issue with dry fills. You don't have it, and that's kind of a big deal. It's something we'll cover in hydrants. That was number 13. So number 14 is foam differential valve shunt. So it's basically a bypass for the foam unit to move around the proportioner and then out. And really, with the foam units that we use these days, this doesn't even exist, or it's built into the system and you don't have to worry about it. So on some of the older trucks, it's out there, but yeah, I haven't ever seen one. So. Number 15 is a pump transfer valve. The pump transfer valve is, again, I don't have a picture of it because I don't have one handy to take a picture of. So the only pump I'm aware of that the Forest Service ever had that used this was the Darley GMP, the GMP 500. It had two settings. It had a volume setting and a pressure setting. And basically, probably the easiest way to just explain it is you think of a BB4 or Mark III pump head, and we know it's a 4-stage pump. There are 4 sets of impellers, and the first set of impellers spins the water out and into the next set of impellers, and the next set of impellers spins the water out and into the next set of impellers, and so on. That is a set of impellers in series, hence producing more pressure. With the Darley JMP, the JMP, I believe it's JMP 500, with the pumps that actually have a pump transfer valve, and there are other pumps out there, Structural World will have them. Not really a lot in our world anymore. We've gone away from them, but they can do, I believe they're a 2-stage pump, so you can have both of those impellers spinning in series and building more pressure, or you can flip the switch and you can have them spin independently, and they basically become parallel pumping out of one pump, and they increase volume. Well, I need pressure, not volume, generally, in most of what we do. And their volume setting went up to, like, the volume setting would do 500 gallons a minute, but they were only running 2.5-inch hose or suction, and even off a hydrant, I'm only going to get it out about 300 gallons a minute in, so I could potentially exceed the amount of water I had coming in unless I was running dual 2.5s off a hydrant, or I had pulled it apart and rigged it up to a 4-inch. Anyway, generally that's not what we need, and so consequently we've gone away from using those pumps. They're still out there, especially in municipal apparatus. Okay, that was the pump transfer valve. Number 16 is an engine cooler line. It circulates water to and from the chassis engine and kind of helps to cool it. We don't really use these anymore because our trucks are much more efficiently engineered than they used to be. We used to have an old truck that really wasn't designed to be a fire engine. Wait, we still do, but we would park this, Type 3 Model 80 or something on a landing, and we'd be pumping a hose blade and be sitting there running at 2,000 RPMs with PTO going, and the truck would get hot. On some of those, you would pop the hood, and on some of them, you wouldn't pop the hood to make sure you get better airflow and all that. Well, this was one of the things that you could do to help keep that main drive engine cooled off, was the engine cooler line. Nonetheless, I'd seen them on a handful of. No, the only thing I've seen them on is maybe a cabs unit recently. So um, not really very common out there. It may come back. Number 17, on the other hand, is a very common one to use. That's your bypass valve or your recirculation valve or your pump cooler bypass. Um, this one's great. So you turn that little guy right there. He's either a quarter turn. Some of them are more of a dial it out type of thing. And it allows water to route around your plumbing discharges and back into your tank. So we'll show it to you in the bigger picture, diagram of how that works. But basically, it goes straight off the pump discharge and straight into your tank again. It's a small line. Notice this guy. That's 1/4 inch line or so, and that's all it takes. That is all it takes to keep your pump cool and keep your pump from overheating. Keeping your pump from overheating makes it so it doesn't start boiling water in there and potentially have cavitation issues, or probably even more so get really hot in there and then all of a sudden have a rush of cold water when you open a discharge and you shatter something in there like a mechanical seal. So it doesn't take much water. I leave these things open all the time. I think the standard is to close them when you're drafting, when you're pulling on your primer, but they do have check valves in place to make it so even if you don't, it'll work. I used to close them to try and get maximum performance, and I might do that if I was doing a pump test, but generally I leave this thing open all the time. It's cheap insurance. Okay, number 18 is your low volume gravity. So they call it a backpack fill here, which is cool because that's really what you're doing. It's like a number 13, only in 3/4. So you turn this little 1/4 turn valve right there, and over here you fill up your bladder bags. Number 19 is clear water discharge. On the left there, you have one off a Type 6 engine. It's the old 2.5 discharge off the Type 6. Those were fun. And it says freshwater discharge. It's not even numbered. It just says freshwater discharge on there. The idea here is that it's a discharge that foam hasn't gotten into yet or can't get into. Your foam unit is over here. Your foam injection is over here on this. And I come back up and there's a check valve in here and there's a check valve in here. And theoretically, you don't get foam to come backwards into the system and then contaminate this water, and you can spray it around a water source like a creek or something and not kill fish and sink ducks. Here's one on a Type 3. It's a little bigger, and maybe that has a purpose, and maybe it gets necked down 1.5 inches since that's the kind of size of hose we tend to have. But this one's an important one to remember. They can come in handy a lot of times, a lot of places. Don't use it every day, but I do use it at times. Number 20 and 21. Let's see. Book answer. Number 20 is the feed number 2 and or 19. So it's an isolation valve. And I don't even have a picture of one because I don't have one. I've only seen one ever. And it was on a Type 3 off the Mount Baker Snoqualmie. And I think they were fairly new coming into it when that truck was new. Number 21 is the discharge plumbing isolation valve, and it isolates the rear discharge plumbing on a Type 3. It could, in theory, isolate any of those discharges. And why do you want it? What do you use it for? I don't want it. I don't need it myself. But the idea is that I can close all of that off and I can troubleshoot issues or work on things. Or mostly the benefit I see with it is that you can troubleshoot those issues. Don't forget about it when you're winterizing. That would be important. You're not going to find them on Type 6 engines. Not very often unless it's a custom home built type of jobber. The standard models aren't going to have them. Type 3s will. Okay, I'm looking at a number 22. I don't have a picture of, but that's a tank fill with an air gap. So it's like you'll find them on water tenders mostly, and you'll plug a 2.5 into it, and it's just a welded piece of pipe that goes up to the top and air gaps into your tank for the most part. The interesting thing is I can't remember ever seeing a valve on one. So nonetheless, it's an apparatus, I suppose. Another thing that you have in your plumbing configuration are strainers. So your Type 6 engines are going to have a Y strainer like this guy over here. It's not going to be red. It's not actually going to be like that one. It's going to be stainless steel and have a cap. Remember to drain the water out of those when you're winterizing. But inside of that, there'll be a screen that'll catch rocks and debris and keep it from going through your pump. These guys need cleaned out ever so often. Depends on how dirty a water you have, or if you have, little kids throwing sticks in your tank. The other examples there, this is the BLM style rock trap, as is this. They do the same thing. They just work a hair differently. I don't prefer those. I prefer the Y strainer with the big holes in the mesh because water flows better through it and I get more performance. But hey, they keep the rocks out and they keep my pump turning, so they're a good thing. All right, back to page 48. All those valves are listed on page 48, but you also have this diagram that shows you where some of these things are. So the general configuration on a fire engine is that you'll have a tank, and your water will come out and through your tank to pump, or your water will come out from a source. Ooh, my arrows aren't very good, sorry. And it'll go up into your pump, and then from your pump, you can discharge to the fire, you can discharge it into your tank, or that's pretty much it. That's your primer. So one piece with that pump cooling line is this guy right here. And it just goes straight into your tank. And the important thing to remember, I'll hit on that here in another slide, just a moment. So some things to remember. Note there's a star at the bottom. What valves do I need open to be able to accomplish a task? This says pump to fire. Well, really it's tank to fire, not pump to fire, because we're tracking it all the way back to the tank. And that just makes more sense to me. But whatever, that you may see it referred to as pump to fire, you may see it referred to as tank to fire. It'll probably be a word problem type thing that says, if you're pumping from your tank to a fire, what valves do you need open? Well, I'm starting in my tank here, and I come down and I go through my number one, so my number one's going to have to be open. And then it comes through my pump. I have to get my pump primed up, and then I'm discharging out, and I could either go through number 4 or number 3. All right, that's it. That's pump to fire, or better yet, tank to fire. So you'll need your number 1 valve open and a 3 or a 4. So this is draft to tank. Again, I don't like that title. To me, this is source to tank, because out here somewhere I have a source and I'm pumping it into my tank through my number 8. So yeah, in draft to tank, my pump is always drafting water. It's always pulling water from somewhere. But more on that on the pump theory piece. So if I am draft to tank, if I'm drafting water into my tank or pumping from a source into my tank, I go through my number 8, so my number 8 needs to be open, and I go through my pump, and I go through my number 2, so my number 2 needs to be open. Probably not in that order. They probably need to open the number 8 and get your pump primed up and build a little pressure, and then open your number 2. I wouldn't start with all of them open, but the idea is you need to end up with those 2 open, make it work. And draft to fire or source to fire would be my preference, but that's okay. I'm doing the same thing, and I mentioned it before, maybe I didn't, but when I was talking about the number 2 valve, it's just a discharge. So I like to look at my pump as, or I like to look at my engine plumbing as, use this guy, whoops, went too far. Down here is my suction side. I pick one or the other. I'm either going to pump out of my tank or I'm going to pump out of my source and through my number 8. And then on the top side, I'm looking at my discharge. I can discharge water anywhere. In this case, we're talking about discharging to a fire. So from my source, I'm going to pull water in through my number 8, which will need to be open, over here, and out my number 3 or number 4. Okay, while you're doing that, plugged into this source, you could also theoretically be pumping water into your tank. There's no reason you couldn't do so unless the volume demand on the hose lay you're pumping is so high that you can't do it. So you can always refill while you're pumping a hose lay. Something to remember. And in fact, one other piece with that is that your pump bypass line is going to be charged. And if that valve is on and you're pumping from a source to a fire or draft to fire, and your cooler line, your pump cooler bypass line is open, you're going to be refilling your tank at 7 to 12 gallons a minute anyway. So it's likely that at some point while pumping this hose lay, your tank's going to get full and start to overflow. And that's what's causing it, because your bypass line is open. There's a handful of ways to deal with that, and maybe we'll explore that another time, but the easiest piece is just to shut your bypass down. But make sure somebody's still flowing water out in your hose lay if you do that. Okay, that concludes our session on valves.